All right, today we are diving into an absolutely incredible medical case study. I mean, this is a story about a surgery where the line between life and death was just razor thin. And the only thing standing in the way of disaster was meticulous planning and flawless execution. You know, for most of us, anesthesia is this thing we just take for granted. It's a miracle, really. You go into the operating room, you count backward from 10, and poof, you wake up and it's all over. It makes surgeries that would have been impossible just a century ago feel, well, routine. But what happens when that miracle becomes the single biggest threat? What if the very drugs meant to keep you safe and comfortable could unleash a catastrophic chain reaction inside your own body? For some people, that isn't some far-off hypothetical. It's a terrifying, life-threatening reality. So let's meet the patient at the center of the story. He's a 14-year-old boy diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or DMD. Now, he needed a major spinal fusion surgery, which is pretty common for kids with this condition. But here's the problem. His DMD, which is a genetic disorder that progressively weakens every muscle in the body, meant that for him, anesthesia wasn't a safety net. It was a minefield. The medical team knew this going in. They knew they were facing a mission with absolutely zero room for error. So they broke it down and identified 3 distinct, life-threatening challenges they would have to conquer to get him through this safely. And that's what we're going to walk through today. So let's really dig into why this operation was so incredibly high stakes. The team had to understand every single risk, every potential point of failure before the patient even entered the operating room. And a look at his pre-op assessment tells you the whole story. He was classified as ASA 4. That's the second highest risk category there is, reserved for patients with a severe, life-threatening disease. They knew he had a history of difficult intubation. They knew he was at high risk for a terrifying condition we'll get into called malignant hyperthermia. And on top of all that, the disease had already taken a serious toll on his heart and his lungs. Okay, so that brings us to the very first hurdle. The first thing you have to do in any general anesthesia, secure the patient's airway. For this young man, this first step was potentially the most dangerous moment of the entire procedure. And this wasn't a surprise, not at all. He'd had surgery when he was 7, and the team back then struggled to get a breathing tube in. They could barely see his vocal cords. The team knew they were walking right back into that exact same scenario. Only this time he was older, the surgery was bigger, and the stakes were so much higher. So what was causing the problem? Well, it was this trifecta of anatomical challenges. He had a small jaw, a high-arched palate, and his neck just didn't have a lot of extension. You put those 3 things together, and it creates a really difficult path for a breathing tube. A standard approach was almost guaranteed to fail. So what was the solution? An absolutely ironclad 4-step plan. They weren't just going to try one thing and hope for the best. No way. Plan A was a video laryngoscope, basically a camera on a stick to give them a perfect view. They'd use a stylet to help guide the tube. They chose a nasal tube for better stability during the long surgery. And, crucially, they had a flexible fiber optic scope ready and waiting as the ultimate backup. They were prepared for anything and everything. Okay, airway secured. Challenge 1. Complete. But the team immediately had to pivot to challenge 2. This one was invisible, a hidden danger lurking inside the patient's own muscle cells, just waiting for the wrong chemical trigger. We're talking about malignant hyperthermia, or MH. It's this rare genetic disorder that can be set off by the most common anesthetic gases. And when it's triggered, it causes the body's metabolism to just spiral out of control. It's like a metabolic fire ignites inside you. Body temperature skyrockets, muscles lock up, and vital organs start to shut down. And for patients with DMD, the risk is way, way higher. This meant the team had to navigate that anesthetic minefield we talked about. The standard, everyday drugs, the inhaled gases, and certain muscle relaxants were completely off the table, forbidden. Instead, they had to rely on a special technique called total intravenous anesthesia, or TIVA, using only drugs like propofol and remifentanil, which they knew were safe and wouldn't trigger MH. And just look at the safety net they built around this plan. They used a special MH-safe anesthesia machine, one that uses carbon filters to literally scrub any trace of triggering agents out of the system. They had the full MH emergency cart right there in the room, stocked with 36 vials of the antidote, dantrolene. They were watching his temperature constantly and checking his blood every single hour for the earliest signs of muscle breakdown. It was incredible. So they have a secure airway, they've neutralized the MH risk, but the third massive challenge still remained: the simple, inherent fragility of the patient's body, which had been weakened by 14 years of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And you can see that fragility right here in the numbers. His cardiac ejection fraction, that's a measure of how well his heart pumps blood, was down to 45%, well below the normal range. Even more alarming, his vital capacity, the maximum amount of air he could physically breathe out, was only 35% of normal. His heart and lungs were essentially running on fumes before the stress of surgery even began. So to manage this, the team basically needed X-ray vision into his body, second by second. They used an arterial line for a continuous beat-to-beat blood pressure reading. A central line gave them insight into his fluid status. And this is amazing. They used a transesophageal echo, which is a live ultrasound probe that goes down the esophagus and gives them a constant video feed of his heart function. Plus, because it was a spinal surgery, they were monitoring all the nerve signals to make sure his spinal cord stayed safe. So you have these 3 monumental challenges. And for each one, the team had a meticulous, multi-layered plan. The question is, how did all this preparation actually translate into a successful outcome? How did it all play out? Well, the surgery itself, which took hours, went off without a hitch, but the team knew the fight wasn't over. They made a critical decision. His lung capacity post-op was just 250 milliliters. To put that in perspective, that's less than a can of soda. There was no way he could breathe on his own. The risk of his lungs just failing was far too high. So they decided to keep him safely asleep and on the ventilator. And his recovery in the ICU was managed just as carefully as the surgery. He stayed on the ventilator initially. Then on day 1, they moved him to a less invasive BiPAP machine. By day 2, his muscle enzyme levels started to normalize, which was a fantastic sign. And then, finally, 72 hours after the surgery began, he was strong enough to have the breathing tube removed. A day after that, he was out of the ICU. You know, the doctors who wrote this case study summed it up just perfectly. This wasn't just another surgery. For patients with incredibly complex conditions like DMD, anesthesia is a battle of life and death. And what this story shows so clearly is that it's a battle that is won not by luck or by hope, but by foresight, by teamwork, and by an absolutely uncompromising commitment to preparation.